Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on the challenges of detecting new types of drugs and contraband being smuggled into correctional facilities. During today's discussion, the speakers will touch upon the types of smuggled substances, the techniques to detect contraband in the mail, and the importance of focusing on contraband detection versus identification. So before we get started with the presentation, I want to just take a minute to introduce you to our speaker panel. So first up, we have Rebecca LaFosse, who brings a diverse law enforcement skills to the Race Secure Professional Services team. With over 10 years of experience as a narcotics detective, she led many drug-related undercover investigations while also being active in the Drug Enforcement Agency's Pill Diversion Task Force. She was one of the first law enforcement officers in her state authorized to purchase narcotics over social media, being able to take cases in new directions. And she also has numerous instructor certifications, and she supports our customers in their mail screening efforts to stop illicit drugs and contraband being smuggled in the mail, while also helping them to establish best practice processes. Then we have Will Plummer, who is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army, where he earned a Bronze Star with Valor as a Master Explosive Ordnance Disposal Technician. He commanded multiple Special Operations Support Units and served as a certified EOD team leader and a master instructor. He managed thousands of full-spectrum EOD operations and directed VIP security support for the last 8 U.S. presidents over the course of his military career. And as Race Secure's Chief Security Officer, he consults with our customers to evaluate and strengthen their mail security strategies through risk assessments and the implementation of standard operating procedures. He also heads up our Race Secure Professional Services team. And last but not least, we have David Hale. Before joining Race Secure, David was a decorated law enforcement officer where he worked on narcotics investigations, led special response teams, and was selected to be a member of the Federal Organized Crime and Drug Task Force. During his tenure, he frequently engaged with corrections facilities on drug smuggling and trafficking investigations within the prisons. In addition to law enforcement investigations, he is skilled as our hazardous materials disposal and response operator. David is also one of our professional services trainers in narcotics and illicit drug detection. And he also partners with our corrections customers across the country as he assists in their mail screening operations to find dangerous substances and contraband in their mail. So thank you all for taking the time out of your day to discuss this important topic. And with that, I'll hand the baton over to Will Plummer, and he'll start taking us through the presentation.
Thank you very much. So thank you for coming in today. We really appreciate everybody's attendance. Just a little company overview before we start so you can understand where we're coming from and where the information is being pulled from. We are headquartered here in Boston. We do build and manufacture. I'll talk about the machines towards the end. Everything here in the United States. We have other components, parts of the company that are up in Canada. So we do have a multinational organization. And we have units that we spread across the United States and most continents. Many of the things that we do with corporate, some of the organizations on the bottom are corporate security, executive protection, and we try to make sure that mail is safe before it gets into anybody's hands and they end up having an accident or incident. We are also deployed with state DOCs and county jails across the United States, and we do mail screening for G8 world leaders, Department of Defense, and state DOCs, etc. Next slide. So when we start talking about corporate or corrections and mail, we've got a few different components that we work in and around. One is law enforcement is a key component of drug contraband interdiction strategies. We try to focus on making sure that what is going into the facility is what's supposed to be there, and we make sure that items such contraband and other things are kept out. One of the biggest problems across the United States we see in corrections is legal mail. Personal mail can be digitized, and there's a lot of other efforts that go into place depending upon state to state which way you go. But legal mail is the one big problem that we see everybody has. Corrections officers don't have the ability to open it. There's amendments that that preclude that from happening. And it's the one place that people can still try to hide something. Legal documents, we've also been finding them hand carried back to court that have been an issue. So individual goes to court, they're clean when they leave the facility. When they come back in, either passing for family members or lawyers or whoever else they come in contact with, or even hospitals, they bring their legal note back with them, their legal documentation, and oftentimes it's contaminated. The other thing we've worked on recently is books, magazines, newspapers, periodicals, other personal items that come in, they are also often taken. So there's several tricks out there, but even if you think you're ordering something from, say, Amazon or one of the larger companies, it still has the ability for somebody to get into the mail stream and, unfortunately, start trying to put contraband into the facility. These methods and methodologies change continually based on the ingenuity of the individuals involved. And what we try to do is stay in front of it and try to make sure that everything that goes in is supposed to be in, and everything that stays out is supposed to stay out. Next slide. So we're going to talk about mail being an easy entry point. And from this, I'm going to transition off to David to let him begin working on his slides.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. So as you see across the top, mail is becoming the leading source of inmate overdoses. The recent statistics that we have found came out till 2018 was the most recent date that the statistics ended at. So from 2001 to 2018, the inmate overdoses and alcohol deaths have increased roughly 600% during that time frame. From 2014 to 2018, the overdoses and alcohol-related deaths actually increased from 50 in 2014 to 249 in 2018. So we saw a really big spike in that time frame. That's 4 years, and they went up almost 200 over that 4 years per year. We can only imagine at this point what the new statistics will show, but unfortunately, this is the most recent. On top of that, we're going to have staff exposures. Workman's comp complaints are going to be a huge issue. Also, staffing is always an issue in law enforcement or corrections right now. It's hard to fill any of these roles. So if you've got individuals that are having to go out due to staff exposures, that means you've got other staff coming in trying to fill these voids and take time in those positions. Also, it's generally bad publicity. Those tend to hit the news market and media outlets very quickly, and it just looks bad for the department or the agency. Lawsuits are another big thing that is coming up. 2022, 2023, we've seen an increase in family members suing the facilities, the state, the agency, everyone involved when their loved ones pass away from an overdose while they are in custody. They are arguing in the courtrooms that their family was or deserved to be protected by the staff of the facility that they were detained in. And so far, those lawsuits have actually been able to continue in court. Next slide, please, Maria. Again, talking about bad publicity. Media loves to go after bad things and rarely ever finds the good things that we are able to accomplish in corrections and law enforcement. They talk about the drugs getting into the facility often. Whenever you hear about overdoses, they want to know why these narcotics are able to enter into the facilities or why these chemicals were able to enter into the facilities. They never talk about the steps that are being taken already by most of the states and local agencies that are attempting to interdict or combat all of these narcotics and other contraband that are coming into the facility. Also, what this does is it leads the facilities to have a lack of reporting. They're not going to want to report overdoses. They're not going to want to report any kind of narcotics coming into the facilities that they're locating or seizing, anything along those lines, because most things end up being turned into somehow being a bad thing and not a good thing, even though everyone is trying their hardest to stop especially opioids from coming into the facility and creating these life-threatening issues. Rebecca, you got anything?
Oh, we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so drivers for narcotic usage. What we have to think about is that addiction doesn't stop because an individual becomes incarcerated. The reality starts to set in that detox is coming. And so if you think about your street dealers, they're going to exploit that when they're incarcerated. So this large booming prison economy occurs when you think about criminal activity. We have a reference from Boston Herald that says that treated paper sheets can go up to $35,000 a sheet. More commonly in our prisons, we're seeing $3,000 for an entire sheet of treated paper with whatever that substance can be. It's easy to disperse. And then it leads to our last point here on this slide, is that our synthetics and the emerging drugs are able to bypass our identification devices and chemical tests. So we have to think like criminals are 3 steps ahead of us. If we want to go to the next slide, Miranda, I'll touch base on that a little bit more. So referring to that, with criminals being 3 steps ahead of us, they're finding that some of the emerging contraband that's becoming popular in our prisons are easier to hide. And that's because there's less of it that's needed in order to get that high that maybe one of our incarcerated individuals who might suffer from addiction on the outside needs in order to just get by. You have gang activity and communications that's happening between prisons. We all know what kites are. They're finding ways to use the mail as a kite to communicate with prisoners that are inside of the same facility or other facilities. And then you have, again, the evolving contraband and narcotics, which we'll touch point on in the next slide.
Let me ask a question real quick.
Yeah.
Both you and David. What's the difference between identification and detection when you're trying to run an interdiction campaign?
I'll go ahead and jump on that one. Well, to start it, once an officer becomes comfortable with fighting, one interdiction avenue, you have to think a criminal is already 3 steps ahead of them, so they have another way to get that contraband in. When it comes to identification, most of our identification devices have a sustained library, and it has to be updated in order to keep up with emerging narcotics. Your common narcotics, which we'll touch base on, those are something that you'll find in identification devices, whether that be a field test kit or any kind of unit, and even to your state lab level. So detection, we're just trying to find something that doesn't belong. Identification, we're not trying to identify it because most of the time you can't identify everything.
So there's one other person that we run into in facilities across the United States. Every time you go into a mailroom, generally speaking, there's one person that knows who all the bad actors are, knows that every third letter that comes in from this individual to this other one is usually tainted, and we'll put those aside immediately. It's a hard thing to quantify, but in the majority of the facilities that we go into, if you identify the individual that's in there doing the screening in and day out, they have more intelligence on the facility and the individuals involved than possibly many of the other COs, because they see everything as it comes in. It's just something that it's a hard person to quantify, but usually inside of the facility, that 1 or 2 individuals are extremely worthwhile in trying to screen mail and minimize anything that gets in. But it's based on ingenuity and the human being.
That's a good point too, Will, to bring up. If you're thinking about mail rooms, there's 2 different types of employees that work in there. You have your mail screeners and you have your mail sorters. The screeners are the ones that we really are going to want in our mail rooms because they're looking for the contraband. They're not just separating the mail to go to an inmate. They're looking for contraband. And the longer they do it, the more they're in that mail room, they really become interdiction experts when it comes to the mail, because they're looking for all of those factors that can display fictitious mail or fictitious legal mail and why it doesn't belong. And they're able to clarify that to the rest of us, which gives us those tips when it comes to disciplinary action or further investigation into that inmate.
Yeah. So one question for you guys is, so we're talking about the mailroom and the typical mail stream that comes in. What about documents that are coming through like the intake areas? How does that fit into this overall process?
Yeah, I'll jump on that, Amy. Some of the facilities that we are in currently have actually gone ahead and deployed devices such as ours in those intake areas. What this is allowing us to do in those facilities is screen any sort of mail coming back in, any kind of legal paperwork if they're coming from the jail, any kind of paperwork from the hospital, even to the point where they're any individual that is employed at the facility and has to come inside, not only are they getting their body scan and their bags x-rayed, now any kind of paperwork due to the increased amount of treated paper coming in, even their paperwork is getting scanned before they can come into the facility as well. Yeah, so today's mail screening techniques, we've noticed have become ineffective. You do get a lot of hit or miss results, and they are very resource heavy and time sensitive. So we'll talk to these a little point by point. So tactile inspection, obviously that increases the exposure rate for your staff inside the facilities. Individuals wearing PPE such as gloves or masks. If individuals don't wear gloves, then they're having tactile inspection, then you run the risk of absorption through the skin for a lot of these different chemicals and narcotics. Bulk x-ray screening. So bulk x-ray screening is good for certain aspects, but when it comes to more finite things such as small amounts of powder or drug-soaked paper, things along those lines, you're actually going to miss out on a lot just using bulk x-ray screening. Chemical testing, again, we've talked to some of the points where a lot of these narcotics are not going to be in libraries that are in your device. And that's because they've either changed the chemical compound of the narcotic that's coming in, or it's something that wouldn't be in a narcotic library, such as Raid or oven cleaner, embalming fluid, things along those lines. Canine units, again, most canines are trained on specific narcotics and specific odors. So as those odors change with the chemical compounds, then the canine is not going to be able to be utilized to locate specific narcotics that it's not trained on. And that goes the same again for the cleaning elements, such as Raid and embalming fluid and things along those lines as well. Light tables and black lights are good. They do cause, again, a higher risk of staff exposures by having to open up the envelope, get it out, or looking through the envelope. It is a lot harder still to see the treated paper, especially the professional treated paper that we're starting to see come out a lot more. Light tables and black lights are missing a lot of that. Verifying lawyer mail and rudimentary investigation. It's they kind of go hand in hand. You're making a lot of phone calls. You're looking up addresses. You're looking up zip codes, seeing how many stamps are on the package to see if it came from the right area, things along those lines. What I would actually recommend is doing it the other way around, where if you have a detection device, you can detect something in the parcel that's coming in, and then you can start your investigation from that point on, where you would contact your lawyer and make sure that it actually did come from them.
I think that's it for that slide. We want to the next one. Okay, so one of the things that we're talking about is narcotics detection versus identification. Next slide.
Yeah, so if we talk about, evolving drugs, if you think about it from a street level, known DEA substances listed Schedule 1 through 5. People who work either on the street or inside of DOCs, most of us, if we're investigating that, we have some kind of background to learn about known common drugs, what you have listed here, your meth, your cocaine, marijuana, all different types of opioids. And then even down to like tobacco, which is considered contraband inside of a facility. Those are all drugs that most identification kits can look for. Most libraries contain some kind of methamphetamine, cocaine, marijuana, and they're able to swab or test that suspicious substance and come back with a positive reading. If we go to the next page, okay, David, if you want to go ahead and start with this.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up also is some of the narcotics that we're used to seeing either on the street or coming into the facility, when they're being put into legal mail and we're not giving the amount of scrutiny to that legal mail just because it says it is legal mail. We're affording individuals the opportunity to bypass us and get it into the facility because it might not be soaking wet. It might be powder. Methamphetamine's coming in pill form now. A lot of things are coming in pill form. So you have the opportunity to stop some of this contraband coming into the facility with good legal mail interdiction. So just wanted to point that out, that stuff is changing. It's harder to see some of the things that are coming in, even as regular drugs. Methamphetamine's not crystal meth anymore. It's a little bit of everything now. And it kind of goes along with what we're going to talk about With the changing for the new like synthetic narcotics that are coming into the facilities or non-narcotics, chemical intoxicants, however we want to classify any of that. Some of the big things that we're starting to see show up are synthetic designer drugs. So you're going to see this on a lot of treated paper. You can see it in a little bit of powder, maybe a pill or two, but for the most part, this is what's going to be in your treated paper. And these synthetics actually mimic LSD, MDMA. So you're going to get the individuals that almost have that bath salts high or the euphoria that's along those lines. The next one that we're going to see, everyone knows, synthetic cannabinoids. It's going to be your THC liquids, your CBDs, K2, spice, anything along those lines. We're going to be seeing that come in on treated paper, powder, liquid, plant steel. It's coming in on the ink now. It's coming in pictures. So they've gotten a lot more intelligent on the ways to try to defraud the system and get it into the facilities. Next is going to be a big one. It's going to be your synthetic opioids. Obviously, fentanyl is going to fall into that. Carfentanil is going to fall under there. A lot of this stuff is coming out of Mexico now through just massive super labs, which is very unfortunate because they're able to push it out at an extremely potent rate to the United States and a ton of other countries. What this does, though, is this allows it to come in treated paper. It allows it to come in powders and liquid form. So you have the higher risk for staph exposures, especially if you're still opening mail, if you get personal mail coming into your facility, birthday cards, anything along those lines. If you're having to open the stuff, as soon as you open anything that's folded, you're going to automatically get that poof that is provided from the fold. And then that's generally when your staph exposures are actually going to occur. Treated paper, if it's done poorly, if it still has the liquid residue, then you're going to get some through absorption. But when you're looking at carfentanil, a new one that's coming out is decythal isotonazine. It's a tough one. I'm not a pharmacist, obviously, but it is actually coming out. It showed up in Philadelphia, California, and Denver areas late last year. Philadelphia researchers have actually said that it's going to be 20 to 40 times more potent than what fentanyl is right now. So that's just another item that these synthetics are able to change. They're able to change their composition. They're able to change their chemical compounds so that it has the same reaction as whatever drug that they're trying to mimic, but the chemical compound is different. So they're not going to show up on your normal, your narc kits or anything like that. Something on the street where you can just pop it, put it in and test it. You might see that it yields a negative field test, but you have individuals that are overdosing actively inside of your facility and you can't figure it out. It's going to be things along the synthetic line. And again, as they become more and more potent, because every one of the users are chasing that original high that they got, so it goes more and more potent. It becomes more and more dangerous, not only to the inmates that are in our care and custody, but to the staff. And staff is definitely someone that we want to take care of front to back. A next one, I'm sure that it's starting to make its way throughout the country and everyone's starting to hear about it, is xylazine. And this one is a little bit of my soapbox, and this is why Rebecca threw it over to me. So again, we both work narcotics. We started buying xylazine in my location in the Southeast, probably close to 4 years ago, and we didn't have a clue what it was. But xylazine's come out now, and now it's showing up again, treated paper, powders, and liquids. The huge downside to xylazine for the facilities is that it causes individuals that are overdosed to become Narcan resistant. So not only do you have to worry about, again, your inmates becoming Narcan resistant, which is going to cause more deaths in your custody, but you also have to worry again about the staffing issues where staff gets exposed to it. You get a couple staff members that flag out, and then Narcan, there isn't enough Narcan or it's not working on your staff members or the inmates, leads to a really, really sad day for the whole facility. So being able to find these things that aren't going to be in normal field test kits, aren't going to be able to keep up with drug libraries oftentimes. As soon as the DEA makes something a scheduled narcotic based off the chemical buildup or the molecular structure of the narcotic, all they do is change one molecule and turn it into a brand new synthetic drug, which takes it out of most libraries immediately.
Yes, a quick question, David. So we all track and synthetic opioids generally used to to wean people off of an opioid addiction. Where's xylazine getting picked up at? Is there legitimate use for it, or is it simply for illicit use?
So xylazine is called Tranq because it is a FDA approved tranquilizer for animals and animals only. They're currently, to my knowledge, it's not scheduled. It's just FDA approved, but again, only for animal use. So what they're doing is it's very cheap, very easy to get. They'll take the xylazine, they'll get either heroin or fentanyl, they'll cut it, which is normal across the board. But xylazine is what they're using instead of something like creatine or baby formula or something along those lines, Similac. Instead, they put the xylazine in with the fentanyl, and then you're not only getting the extreme potency of fentanyl or carfentanil, now you're also getting it 20 times that or 10 times that probably with xylazine. But the negative effect, again, is it's super easy. It's becoming very, very popular. People want Tranq everywhere. But individuals are passing away from it daily now, almost to the rate of fentanyl because of the Narcan issues that it provides.
I mean, I can transition from there.
Yeah.
You think about something that might have a medical use or FDA approval. Well, we transition to our chemical intoxicants, and a lot of people are very shocked to hear that this is being sent into a DOC, things like embalming fluid, oven cleaner, and bug spray, but it's happening every day. So David and I cover the United States. We have the United States split in half. I cover the West Coast, he covers the East Coast. I'm in Louisiana, and where I'm at, I cover Florida as well. But there's facilities that we go into on the daily because this is our job. And they're testing substances that we're finding, and it's coming back negative. Well, when somebody's holding a piece of mail and you can smell Raid coming off of that, most of us in the South know what Raid smell like because we need it. But you can smell the bug spray coming off of there. And a lot of, for me, as somebody who only dealt with common or CDS listed drugs, I was curious. I started doing research into that. Will and Miles, who are part of our team, were very helpful in my learning curve of why somebody's going to ingest bug spray. But really, people are just chasing that dopamine high. They don't care how they get it. They just want it. And these are non-identifiable substances for any library. I don't know any library from any test kit out there that contains oven cleaner, bug spray, or embalming fluid. And the problem with that is you may identify it, you may detect it, and you may have somebody that does a follow-up step trying to identify it. It's coming back as negative. So what do? Do you allow that to continue into your facility? No, we don't want a substance, especially an unknown substance, into our facility, so we have to stop it. So let's say the next step, we bag it and place it into evidence, and we start a report number for that, and it gets sent off to a state lab. It's listed on your evidence envelope as an unknown substance. Well, it's an unknown substance, so what is your state lab going to test for? They're going to test for one of those CDS listed drugs, your common drugs or controlled dangerous substances that are listed through the DEA. That's what they're going to test for. So when they're testing for those drugs, they're not testing for embalming fluid that you can buy on Amazon for $10. Will and I have done that. You think about your oven cleaner. Who doesn't have these common chemicals in their home? Bug spray, again, I know it's more prevalent in the South, but we have bug spray all over our country. It's not that hard to do that. I've treated paper with Pine Sol. People will use Pine Sol and ingest that to feel some kind of euphoric high or something similar to that high that they get when they're using our CDS listed drugs.
So I got a question on that one, actually.
I figured.
Across the board, what's the one thing that we're seeing the most of in the facilities we're running out of?
Ooh, it's, for me, we're in the facilities that I'm covering, it's either embalming fluid or bug spray.
And David, what about you?
It's a hodgepodge. A lot of it's going to be the synthetic, like K2 is still going to be the biggest one. We're starting to see synthetic opioids and xylazine are starting to pick up a little bit more, but it is still K2 is the forerunner in my opinion.
Well, I asked that question because with Becca's point about having East and West, regionally this changes. Mm-hmm. It really does depend on what they can get their hands on and and what is available. And another factor is what they like. So inside of your facilities, that is obviously something you think about, but look a little bit larger and they might tell you what's coming your direction in your facility as well.
So one more question, guys, and this is probably more for the previous slide than this slide, but for the drugs that are being tested for and they know what they are, so the common substances, Rebecca, that you were talking on, so they're getting tested, but why are they still getting passed? Why are they still getting in?
Well, if you think about common substances, David kind of touched to this. They change the chemical combination just slightly, and you're not going to be able to identify that. Also, a lot of these substances, I had already pointed to that, but you have your synthetic drugs. Synthetic drugs are always evolving. Criminals are always 3 steps ahead of us. They're finding a way to beat that test. Sometimes tests give negative results. Sometimes they give positive results, and that can be fictitious results. You can have something that isn't methamphetamine, but it's coming back as methamphetamine, even though it's not methamphetamine. There's so many different ways that an identification device or tool that we have can fail.
Okay. I think actually that's probably a really good segue into the next slide. So Miranda, maybe you could fast forward for David and Rebecca.
Yeah, so I mean, I call this my soapbox. We talk about identification and detection, and one of the things that I have become personally passionate about is detection, because we are finding that identification is failing. And even if you have the best identification device out there, you have to update that library. You have to have it ready to test those emerging synthetic drugs that are coming out, as well as those things like embalming fluid and oven cleaner and raid. And they just don't. They're not at that capability yet, and our criminals know that. So we want to detect the contraband. This is what we go into facilities and we tell them on the daily. The main purpose for this is to stop these substances from getting into our compound. We don't want that in our prisons. Our frontline investigators, our frontline from stopping this is our mailroom. They're investigators, they're gathering information, they're seeing what kind of substance are out there. If you go into your mailrooms now, they'll be able to tell you, yeah, we're finding bug spray all the time. We smell it. That's our first indication. So the detection is what's going to stop these items from coming in. When it comes to identification, of course, that's typically a follow-up procedure. If you have a screener that's telling you, yeah, there's a substance on here, we cannot send this into the facility. You have whoever your follow-up investigator is come in, they test that. If you get a positive identification, awesome, great. That's going to help make this case easier for you. But then if you continue through the process and you're not getting a positive result, what do you do? How do you let that into your facility? You allow that contraband that your screener's finding from different indications into the facility. So that's where we have to decipher the difference between detection and identification, and which can play a bigger role into stopping the contraband from coming into our facilities. David, I figured you have a couple points on this one too.
Yeah, I mean, just the one thing that I want to hit on is the high volume of mail cannot test each piece. This is going to be seen by most of the individuals that are watching our webinar today. So a lot of facilities have gone to the digitization of personal mail, which has drastically increased the amount of legal mail that is coming into the facility. Now, I would love to be able to throw out a percentage to you to tell you what the actual amount of legal mail coming in is true legal mail. But what we can say is, through different studies that we have found, talking to different agencies in different states across the whole entire country, is that an increase in legal mail follows the digitization of legal mail every time. So individuals think that they're going to be cutting down the amount of narcotics or contraband coming through the mail because they stopped personal mail from coming in. All that did was increase the amount of fraudulent legal mail that was coming in. It was already coming in. Now it just made it fourfold. And those narcotics and contraband are still able to get in because, again, going back to like Will spoke about early on, we do not have the legal authority to just open legal mail without having a good reasonable suspicion or probable cause, depending on your state. And we understand that. But what this has done is put the increase in legal mail onto the mail staff. They're not going to be able to do anything with it, shy of it being blatantly obvious. And then again, this is where detection comes in. This allows you to detect contraband and other narcotics coming into your facility without having to violate any of those rights and privileges. And that's been a big thing across the country as well, is the amount of legal mail and not being able to touch it. So the high volume is definitely showing up across all the facilities.
So some of the other items that apply on this, I keep going down this list, things you don't necessarily think about, second and third order effects. So you rely on canines to go through your facility. You rely on canines to screen and sort everything you have going on. Canines use their nose. And we start looking at some of the drugs that David and Rebecca were talking about. The reaction to the dog using the innate capability to smell is hazardous to the animal. So you can't train a dog for, some of these drugs, some of the combinations, because just allowing them to do that will kill them. We've talked about the change in chemical makeup several times. I do think that I'd like to know with Rebecca or David about the bottom bullet. Emerging substances, I know we talked about it before, but what's one of the ways that we are seeing, what's one of the ways that we're seeing some of these chemicals coming in inside the mail itself?
Yeah, David has touched on treated paper a lot, but the majority of those household chemicals are coming in on treated paper. It's very easy to make, even professional quality looking. A lot of screeners will say, yeah, I mean, we're identifying things. Like if your screeners that are good, they're obviously going to see an ounce of cocaine that's in the mail. They're going to know, they're going to find it. That's usually something that they find. When it comes to treated paper, if they're taking a piece of paper and they're dipping it in a substance and they're letting it dry in the sun or they're cooking in the oven, yeah, you're probably going to see the alteration from that substance on the paper. But let's say they take the ink cartridge and they place embalming fluid, or they place oven cleaner or Raid into that ink cartridge. They print it onto the paper, making it look like a legal document. Your smell is going to be concealed by the ink. The texture is going to be concealed by the words that are pressed on the paper, and any kind of discoloration is going to be concealed by that black ink. So if you have somebody, you have a mail screener who says, we're finding that there's something on here, and then you have, let's say, a CO who's actually on the compound, he's bringing the legal mail to the inmate, he's opening it in front of them, that CO could be holding that in his hands, and he's hopefully wearing gloves, but he's not going to feel a texture change. He's not going to smell the odor of embalming fluid, which Will and I personally know is very strong. And they're not going to see that discoloration. It's not going to show up. You hold it under a black light, it's not going to show up because whatever that substance is being concealed in the ink. And so it is very hard from the human eye to identify that.
Yeah, and along those lines, talking about the ink, I mean, just some of the cooler things that we've seen in the innovation are pictures coming into facilities that have had both morphine in some and ketamine in the others. So when we say that they're steps ahead of us, again, they have to get it right every day. We just have to get it right one time for our prosecution. But that mentality also doesn't carry over when the narcotics are strong enough now to kill people. Now we need to catch them as quickly and as swiftly as possible in order to, one, deter it from happening again, and two, to save lives inside of our facilities.
You know that. Sorry. Well, I was just saying that reminds me of something I always like to point out to administrators. If you walk into your mailroom today, you may have provided those screeners with gloves and PPEs, masks, and maybe those tables that vacuum out the substance, but walk in there and tell me how many of your screeners are wearing the protective gear that you provide them. I am guilty of doing that. I've done that. I've been exposed to substances and I've had to be hospitalized from it. But go in there. It doesn't matter how many times you tell them to wear it, how many are actually wearing that. So they're feeling with their hands for the texture changes in the paper. So they're exposing themselves even more to that substance because they're not wearing the protective gear that they're provided.
Right, so I had one more thing I wanted to bring out of this, and honestly, this goes to you, David. Without naming any place or anything, it's not just the regular mail on the way in. It also can be administrative mail. It's already walked into your organization. Dave, you want to touch on that for a second?
Yeah, so like Will has alluded to, individuals inside certain facilities. So if you have a mail system established to where parcels can go from staff directly to inmates and there's no real oversight of what's occurring, it's unfortunate. In law enforcement, I worked with crooked or dirty individuals in that job function. I've worked with federal entities and federal agents that had ended up having corrupt agents with them. And it's going to be the same. The facilities have individuals that are susceptible to corruption, and it occurs. It's an unfortunate fact that we have to deal with at every facility. It'll happen if it hasn't already. But what that has caused is when you have zero oversight of the mail going from staff members into inmates, that provides the avenue for that individual to provide narcotics and drug soaked papers and things along those lines to inmates without ever running the chance of being caught.
Unfortunately, that does happen, right? We don't ever want to talk about that aspect of it, but it's something, if you're running a program, take a look at your own people as well.
Yeah, we saw it live and in action on accident, but we got lucky that we found it while we were there.
All right, thank you. Next. So let's talk about effective mail screening and T-ray video inspection and some examples. So what we look at is the simplest way that we can get from a problem to a solution. With that, we say this whether it's corporate or corrections, we try to focus on normal versus abnormal. If you have 100 things that come in through legal mail a day, and I know that's a large number, but say it's 100. If 95 out of 100 are clean and you can verify that quickly, there's no need to do anything with it. You don't have to increase the problem of complaints from prisoners who have the ability to complain about anything they want to. And those complaints take up time during your staff stay. So those 95 are removed out of it. That way, the time that you would spend looking at a total of 100, you can actually focus down on those 5 and deal with them. Much like an email, we use this analogy all the time. If it gets in, it goes in directly to your inbox. If there's something wrong with it, it ends up in a quarantine. With that, somebody deals with the quarantine. You have a complete staff set up to deal with that. And that's another analogy to look at this. Another one is the TSA airport screen. Majority of everybody walks through without an issue. And majority of your mail can go through without an issue. The amount of time that you spend on the problem ones that come in, some of those will end up being clean. They just get pulled aside for random screening because you want to check it, or they legitimately have something, as Rebecca mentioned, smell or whatever else. Whatever's keying that individual that works in the mailer that says this one's out of place, that's the one you pull aside and you deal with the secondary process, just like the TSA. So it really does take a little bit of a paradigm shift on your program and your procedures. It's just probably even a policy change might be something you have to look at. But how you're doing it would be affected better if you change how you're handling it. The goal is to have a high throughput effective screening process. That's it. Nobody's having any more time added to their day. Nobody's going to get added another 2 hours of work during the workday. You have what you have, or you don't get it done, or you work overtime. Next slide. So one of the ways that we do this is obviously through our system, and it's an example of an optical screening process. As we mentioned before, we can't tell you what it is. We talked about detection versus identification. And what we try to do is detect issues and detect things that stand out. Obviously, in the center one, we're looking at powder that's getting moved around inside of a package. All right. We don't think of white powder threats going into corrections, but what happens when you take a bunch of fentanyl that's powder, you put it into a liquid form, and then you put it on paper, and that liquid dries and that powder comes off. When that happens, you end up with a semi-powder thread in the bottom of your mail. Liquid for us, when you're talking about corrections, again, drugs. Anything that comes in a normal liquid form, you throw it through an X-ray machine, you're not going to see it because an X-ray is just going to be a snapshot in time. The ability to inspect it, move it around, make sure you know what you're holding before it gets to your facility is a very useful tool. The example on the right is our machine in a mobile mode configuration. and you're looking at treated paper that's being moved outside of the manila envelope. So there's a long, like I have a bit more technical soapbox response for my version of what I like to talk about is how this stuff works. And sometimes I go too deep into it, but the reality is when you start treating papers, you start putting stuff in the mail, it's different than everything and different than what you'd expect. That's exactly what we're showing you, is that it's not paper that's simply paper. It's been exposed, it's been changed and treated, and therefore it can be identified and you can pull it out. Next slide, please. So I do, at the end of this, David and Rebecca, I want to bring in on this slide, but these are some examples of what we found across the country. We talk about this one on the top on the left side quite often. It's a USB-C male adapter charger for a cell phone. Didn't really think about it, but if you have illicit cell phones inside your facility, you need to charge them. And if the inmate's not supposed to have that, generally speaking, they will alter their regular charger. And the most likely part to break, because you're trying to hide it, is that male adapter that charges your cell phone. We ask facilities all the time, do you see a bunch of USB-C male adapters? Oh yeah, quite a bit. You have a cell phone problem. So these things lead into more intelligence, more understanding of what's going on. The next one over, oftentimes we've all seen it in mailrooms where people try to pull on the heartstrings. So you're going to have your child go ahead and draw this dinosaur. Well, the dinosaur, everything behind it that's red is where the drugs are at. They try to hide it with crayons, pins, anything to do to alter the surface. And it takes a detection kit to go in and identify exactly what it is. But when you're looking at the paper itself, you can tell that there's something obviously off with it. We talked about legal mail quite a bit. Suboxone strips, that depends on what your state, necessarily has. If you have Suboxone programs in your prison, or if you have Suboxone programs in your state. We see it across the country. It is very different what drugs come in. And you can almost always pick a state that has Suboxone programs for people on the street, because it becomes currency inside and it's much easier for them to get. So they just start putting it in the mail and it gets to the facility on a regular basis. Personal mail, that's usually where the pictures come at, but it's also getting phased out in the facilities because they're going through digitization. We say that that's the solution to it, and there are some stats out there that, and we quoted one or two of them here, that they don't actually fix as much as people think it fixes. But the problem that comes of it is you're going to end up getting court. Almost every state that digitizes ends up being sued because they are taking that piece of paper that's not being handed directly to the inmate from the child or from the family member. They're getting an image of it. They can't actually touch it. And this will continue to be challenged. And books, findings, and I'm not gonna cover the tricks on how to get drugs into a prison through books and through approved vendors, but just know it's happening. And we will absolutely follow up and have a conversation with that if that's something that you want to learn about how to protect yourself against. But it's quite common, and it looks completely legitimate when it goes in, and it's got the right tape on the outside. It came from the right approved vendor. All right. So David, Beck, I did have a question on this. When you start looking at all the possible ways that we've seen drugs go into facilities, just because people always want to hear interesting things, what's the most interesting way that you've seen something go in?
I can give you mine, and it's typically considered an uncomfortable conversation, but it's the reality of the world we live in. I was in a facility, and it wasn't actually a substance. It was a motion of discovery that was sent in by an attorney, and when the screener opened it, it contained child pornography. That was a motion of discovery that's actual courtroom paperwork that's being sent in to somebody who's incarcerated, but it contains something that could have been obviously again, it's uncomfortable to talk about, but the profit that the inmate could have made off distributing those photos, as well as just for personal use, that was huge. And it was concealed in the middle of motion of discovery. So
it's not just drugs that we're finding. It's
no.
Illicit and items that they should not have.
Contraband. Yep.
Yeah, I've got a couple. I'll go back. Obviously, the pictures that we found, that was pretty early on, to be able to see that the pictures look normal, but still have ketamine, morphine mixed into it was pretty impressive. Some of the other ones, some of the outlandish things is, again, legal mail with roughly 3 ounces of a white powder substance, freezer sealed in between just normal paper, in an envelope, in a manila envelope coming from a law office. You would have thought that it was just discovery. And that was a very good, very flattened out 3 ounces of white powder that was coming into a facility that we were able to capture. And then, of course, we've also gotten some razor blades and weapons coming in, which is huge to me because I see that as more of a threat to the staff than I do as a threat to the inmates. So that was really great pop coming into the facility.
I do have to say that, we look at the pictures on here, and these are pretty simple pictures. The detail and the effort that people are putting into concealing the contraband in the mail is absolutely interesting. And I would love to share so many different ways we're finding it, but the level and the expertise that these individuals are going into, if anybody has questions, I will gladly break it down, just not on a recorded platform for more criminals to get the idea.
Our emails and phone numbers are available.
Yes.
All right, so next slide, please. So here's another approach and another method instead of instead of what you might be doing currently. We provide professional services that's optimized for corrections to make sure that you have the support down in that mailroom that you might not currently have. And I'll give you an example. So we talk about image analysis. David and Rebecca are narcotics subject matter experts. They see this stuff every day, and it is a second opinion you can reach out and talk to. It's part of our program. It's part of the services that we provide. But if you look inside your mailroom and say, let's pick I'm not going to name a state, but some states only allow administrative folks to go in and work the mailroom. And the investigator, for example, will come by every Thursday or Friday with a dog. And it's a Monday morning. The Monday is the worst day in the mailroom for corrections because it piles up over the weekend. Monday is always heavy. You could be stuck holding something that's hazardous or toxic inside that facility for several days until an investigator comes in. Or if you question it and you don't necessarily have that subject matter expert in your back pocket, you could let it go through, or you could keep it. You could get complaints. It could go a lot of different directions. It just means that there's a problem that's down there that won't be touched for 3 to 4 days. And that happens quite commonly. Training, you need to be able to provide a flexible approach, and that's what we do provide. We have things like on-demand LMS. Another example, you go into a mailroom and it's got 3 COs working in it. Almost all the time, those 3 COs are either at the end of their career or they're on limited duty because they were hurt. So they're only going to get 45 days in that mailroom, maybe, before they're back inside the towers. So you need to be able to train those folks rather quickly. And we provide support on that, making sure that people are certified. They're using best practices, knowing that what they're looking at and what they're looking for is the most likely high-level threat coming at them. And then again, for our product that we talked about and showed you a little bit of live technical assistance 24/7. A lot of times people will drop off equipment into facilities and they'll just leave. You'll get 1 day of training if they do that at all, and you can't get them on the phone, you can't deal with it. The threats don't stop coming into mailrooms. They continue every day, and inmates complain if you don't drop them off every day. So the ability to respond quickly and the ability to make sure that the folks that you are trying to protect, both inside the facility and those that work for the facility, are safe as possible. All right. Next slide. And this is the last one, and it's really kind of an understanding of the growth inside of protective posture or protective plan. Like we said before, keeping facility officers and inmates safe, that's the goal. Well, we break that down into 4 areas. One thing that's always comes up, especially legal mail, is privacy and confidentiality. We need to make sure that what you're looking at and what you're actually capturing image-wise isn't going to have a violation of HIPAA. It isn't going to have a violation of somebody's personal or legal rights, because that, again, makes problems down the road for the administrative staff. Protecting correctional staff. That is, we hear that across the country, and it's interesting. I got a lot of time in the military, and very rarely do people turn around and go, our first priority is to keep you safe. That's not the way most of our organizations run. And David and Rebecca probably did not hear that every day as a police officer, or going undercover, or dealing with narcotics. But that's a common theme that we hear inside of these facilities, is protecting correctional staff first. because if you don't have them, you can't run the building. Reduced screening time, it's an interesting byproduct of what happens when you take those 100 items going every day and you reduce them to the increased time on those 5, decrease the amount of effort on the 95 because they're screened clean. You actually decrease the amount of work during the day. And every single facility we walk into, and I have not been in one that ever has staffing up to 100%. Everybody is short on time. They're already pulling doubles and doubles on top of triples. And there's just not enough there. And if you can reduce that time, that is worth an amazing amount to an organization that is already just trying to patch holes with people. And the part that's why I asked the question about David and Rebecca is detectable contraband and threats. There's a lot of strange stuff coming in. And you've got to have a really smart set of people down there. And you try to give the right amount of tools to solve those very complex problems. As Rebecca said, they're 3 steps ahead. They got lots of time on their hands, and they want that opioid high. So it's something to think about. That's the way that we try to apply our solutions. It's based in these 4 buckets, and it's something that we've actually pride ourselves on quite a bit. So with that, if there's any questions you'd actually like to answer.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This was great. So once again, everybody, I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A tab that is on the Zoom dashboard. But with that, we do have some questions that have come through. I'll lob those over to you guys. So, Will, this comes back a little bit. You said you have a little bit of a soapbox. So one of them was, how does the Mail Secure detect the drug-treated paper? How does it go about doing that?
Okay, the 30-second solution, and Rebecca's going to laugh if I can actually get this done in 30 seconds. So imagine 15 sheets of paper. You pull out sheet 10, you treat it, you put it back in its place. It's different than the rest of them. So effectively, when we start looking at them optically, they stand out. That one that's different has a different interaction than all the other ones. And paper that's printed together, it was usually cut and put in a ream together, and it was printed, stapled, and sent together. And when you change that one thing out, we can pick up one. There's a longer soapbox, but that's it.
Okay. So a little bit a follow-on to that is, so the Mail Secure will trigger on a piece of paper, even if it's tampered with something, but not necessarily with drugs.
Yes, it will. And the bottom line is, and to Rebecca's point, most of what we see is not illegal. If you go to Amazon and you look at formaldehyde, you buy the 7-ounce bottle. If you scroll to the bottom, it has all the items on that used with to do something illegal with it, right? It's legal to buy all that stuff. So it is only illegal when it hits the confines of that facility. And it's a problem for everybody. But that is the biggest issue that you're seeing right now.
Okay, great. So once again, inviting everyone to put some questions in. But we talked about this a little bit. I'll throw this over to David. So legal mail, and how does this approach, get around the restrictions of screening legal mail? And maybe you could touch on those restrictions a little bit as well.
Yeah. So when it comes to the restrictions, like Will spoke about earlier in the amendments, you have, first, fourth, sixth, and 15th, and all your legal right to counsel, your freedom of speech, your legal right to not self-implicate for mail coming back out of the facility to your law offices. So what the device does is the device is going to be able to detect items coming inside of the mail. We don't open it. We don't look inside of it in any way, shape, or form. So that stops you from having to deal with any of those arguments in court or arguments between lawyers that say, hey, you messed with our mail without my client in your presence. And even if it comes down to the point of you just setting it off to the side, calling the law firm and saying, hey, did you send this? No. Okay, then we'll start an investigation into it then, or we'll go ahead and quarantine that piece of mail and let everyone know that it's been declined entry into the facility, and they can start an investigation from there.
Okay. All right, great. So Rebecca, I believe that you talked about this. So someone's typing in, we focus on identification to prepare for legal proceedings. So with the, discussion, are you saying that we should no longer do that?
Well, as a law enforcement officer, I was taught that identification is a huge part of a prosecution. But that's where a lot of our conflicts coming when it comes to DOCs. That's why I said the first and foremost, our goal should be to keep the contraband out of our facility. That's what we need to do. We're protecting our people, whether it be our staff or inmates. Prosecution is going to follow. You know who your problem inmates are. And if you don't know who those problem inmates are, you're going to discover who they are by the use of detection. Then you're going to have your staff who they have all of their other indicators of why this mail that Mail Secure is telling them has a substance on it could be considered fictitious legal mail. So you're building a case. Mail Secure is your frontline defense. That is the first step when it leads to prosecution. We're screening our mail. We're not screening people who we might find to be, had drug dealers on the outside or who might be our users that are on the inside. We're not screening that. We're screening everybody's legal mail. Then we're finding or detecting something that might be an anomaly to that mail. And then your screeners, most of the time, the people that are in these mail screening rooms are gifted investigators. There has not been one facility I've gone into where I'm blown away by how the skills of the investigators in there. They're going to go through, they're going to look and see that a zip code that it was supposed to come from was actually through a different zip code. It was processed through there, or all of the other indicators. Maybe the packaging is different, the label's different. And then you're going to follow up with whether it be reviewing personal mail or phone calls. And then you're going to continue to build that case. I always give the advice to my screeners and any investigator who might follow up with that is to document everything. Document that inmate, whether it be with Mail Secure, we have video recording and we have photos. You could take a video, you could take a photo of that letter, document the inmate, and then that's when you are finding more and more of that mail coming into that inmate, you're going to be able to form a case and you're going to be able to prosecute that inmate. But the initial goal, the goal always should be that we don't want to allow that contraband into our facilities.
Great. Actually, so you were able to answer the next question I was going to throw out there, which is, okay, Mail Secure, what mechanisms are there to document in order for auditing and chain of custody? So it sounds like, yeah, we take the photos, we have the videos, and then that's what the officers and investigators can use to shore up their case, right?
Well, to play on that too, what we're finding in these facilities, David and I, we are considered interdiction experts, and we are experts now when it comes through interdiction avenue through the mail into DOCs or counties or municipality jails. We get a lot of questions, even from headquarter high up staff. Well, how do we change our policy to help us eliminate the contraband that's coming in through these facilities? A lot of them aren't even really concerned about prosecution. They're not really concerned about disciplinary action. They just want to stop it, just like I'm trying to harp on. But the policies are going to have to change in order to stop the contraband as well. So that's always a question I like to ask administrators. Just review your policy with your mail, go into your mailroom, watch what they do, and everything else will fall into place.
Okay, great. So we're right up on time. So maybe one or two more questions. So if people are adding substances to the printer ink, how is this detected? And will there be an anomaly, or does the substance just become part of the ink?
All right. So I'll jump on this one, and I can tell you that there's a couple facilities that have this exact problem. So I'm going to tell you how to do it, but when you have, generally speaking, replaceable ink cartridges, you can take 2/3 of it, get rid of it, replace it with drugs, like Rebecca mentioned earlier. The reality is, if you don't put enough chemical on that piece of paper, it's not going to get anybody anything except maybe a little headache. And the ultimate goal is to get the drugs inside the facility and ingest and handle and inject the drugs themselves. So you've got to put a lot of it down. There's a few ways tricks to make your printer do things that's not intended, because printing ink is meant to save as much as possible. It's meant to be extremely cost effective, and you start putting the amount of material it takes to get a drug effect in that ink, it takes quite a bit. No, it does not become part of the ink. It generally will run. It looks very different. It stands out. And there's a couple facilities that through intelligence gleaned from the mailroom. They know exactly who's doing it, exactly how to do it. And they've got a step-by-step set of instructions because the inmates told their families and they monitor everything that goes on. And then so they know it's coming in, as a rep said, you'll smell it, part of it, but no, it does not become part of the ink. It stays drugs.
Okay, great. Okay, guys, one final question, a little bit of a crystal ball, maybe not entirely fair, but what do you guys think is the next emerging contraband substance that you may see?
I don't even know how to answer that right now because I'm so shocked that people are ingesting oven cleaner and Raid. That has been emerging over the last 6 months, in my opinion. So I'm still stuck on that right now.
I think that one of the other things that we're going to have to eventually take a look at is a lot of facilities get medications that are able to come in, whether it be from the Department of Veterans Affairs, because they have their medications come from them, so they don't have to pay any bills. Anything along those lines now with narcotics being snuck into counterfeit medications, a lot easier to make it look like Tylenol or hydrocodone or something along those lines, and they're getting just straight fentanyl laced pills. I believe that that's going to be something along the lines also that you're going to start seeing more of is the counterfeit medication coming in, somehow being spoofed. Once you start shutting down the Amazons or the books or anything along those lines, they keep going. Religious mail is going to be your next one that you're going to have to take a hard look at. And then medical is going to be the next one, in my opinion. And it's all going to be synthetics.
I would
Great.
look at drugs that are coming in for animals. The amount of companies now that will sell you all the things your vet would want to put into your animal. I have a couple Great Danes. I can get 120-pound human being sized drugs of any type just by going into a website, and they'll send it to me. It just says not approved for human consumption, and I think that's going to be the next big one coming in.
Great. Okay, crystal ball. Good job. So